Hello, thank you for joining us today. For today's webinar, Rethinking HR Practices in the Age of COVID-19. Today's presenters are Michelle Garbato and Igor Shegolev. And Michelle brings over a decade of progressive experience in public sector human resources at the state and local levels. She's a consultant and change agent and has extensive experience in partnering with clients in creating and implementing innovative solutions to attract and retain highly qualified employees. She has a talent for managing large-scale projects while balancing multiple stakeholder interests and ensuring quality and compliance. She has her master's degree in industrial organizational psychology and holds many related state certifications such as classification and compensation, recruitment and selection, workforce and succession planning, and has served on the board for Southern California Public Management Association Human Resources and the Personal Testing Council of Northern California. Igor is a compensation and human resources practitioner with extensive experience in practicing compensation and teaching business courses at the graduate level. For the last 2 decades, he's held executive jobs in compensation and HR management in both private and public sectors, designing and managing compensation classification and HR information systems. He's taught graduate business courses at Troy University and University of Phoenix, holds a master's degree in education and a master's degree in business science of HR management. Igor is a regular event speaker on topics of compensation in the Society of Human Resources Management and business chapters, and he's been recognized with multiple awards, such as the University of Phoenix Distinguished Faculty. For your convenience, a slide deck for today's presentation is available on the CPS HR Consulting website. The session is also being recorded. We'll post a link to the recording on the same page of our website as soon as it's available. In order to ensure a high quality recording, all attendees are in listen-only mode. So please be sure to keep your mic muted to prevent interruptions during the session. If you have questions for Igor or Michelle, please enter them in the Q&A panel on the right side of your screen. We'll address questions at the end of the presentation as time allows.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us. And I'm going to start our presentation with a picture of this Angora goat. During World War II, Angora wool was a strategic project, pretty much different from actual wool from other sheep in its smoothness and luster. It actually created a very warm clothing for our military during the war, especially Air Force. And production of wool was, of course, heavily subsidized by the government because we needed it fast and we needed a lot of it.
Igor, that's a really good story, but what's that have to do with today's presentation?
Oh, Michelle, well, the point is that the war is long gone. And subsidies are not gone, they're still here. And I'm not trying, we certainly not trying to make any political statement, but Angora goat cost United States government, still to this day, about $60 million a year. Billions were paid in subsidies in few decades. Again, we don't see how is this strategic product anymore, but at the same time, the point we're trying to make, and that's kind of relevant to all our presentation, that times change. Some of our practices do not. And with that, I'm going to pass it on to you, Michelle, to talk about learning objectives and other slides, other topics.
Thanks so much, Igor. That was a really good story to kind of get us started and hone in on what we're really trying to convey today is that as HR practitioners, we really have to be proactive and look at what's changing and what's no longer necessarily effective or the best use and kind of evolve accordingly. So we're going to talk a lot over the next hour in this webinar about changes in business environment due to the COVID and the pandemic, how COVID is impacting labor economics and jobs and what trends we're seeing in the market. We're going to talk about changes in labor composition and job values and skills. So not only how the workforce is being impacted, but what that means at the job level. And really what we want you to take away is feeling informed and being prepared to deal with some of the changes that are inevitably affecting us. So in the next slide, we're going to be talking about what is changing. So what is changing? Industry composition is changing, and we'll show how it's changing in more detail in a later slide. But suffice it to say now that jobs are evolving. We see some jobs that are no longer being needed. Some jobs are being reduced. Others are becoming obsolete. So we're seeing these trends, and this is therefore affecting the workforce composition. So as millions of workers are being displaced, this means that they may have to be retrained for new jobs. As jobs evolve, the job content, so their duties, responsibilities, and processes are changing, and that can affect the job values. So if jobs require more knowledge or critical thinking, this may increase the value of the salaries of the jobs, either positively or negatively. So what are we talking about? A good example during the pandemic was found in the retail food industry. So if we were looking at jobs responsible, let's say for food preparation, and restaurants were closed, organizations were forced to kind of evolve and think of different ways for business. So if a person was tasked with food preparation or perhaps delivery drivers, now they were kind of transitioning into bagging and delivering groceries to the home. And so this was different job responsibilities, and it might have required more complex or different job duties. And so the job value of the job might have changed as well. So what this may mean in the market is that some jobs may have different pay increases as more jobs are being added. So inconsistent wage inflations. So when we're talking about that, we're seeing that some jobs, so for example, some jobs might have, let's say, a 5% pay increase and millions of jobs added, whereas other jobs may have the opposite. So an example of this might be an AI machine operator. This job we've seen become more valuable than a software engineer, even though it requires less critical thinking than an engineer, perhaps. And this might be to the last point of supply and demand. If there are no universities training in the AI machine operator, we have a lower supply of them. And if there's a high demand in the skills in the labor market, then that might impact the job value of the jobs. So in the next slide, we're going to talk about emerging trends in the workforce. Equity, diversity, and inclusion are some buzzwords that we've heard a lot, but it's really, organizations are really starting to look into this, especially with their organizational culture and what this means for HR practices. So companies are really paying attention to equity now more than ever, and we'll talk about this more in subsequent slides. But we're seeing a trend where more states have legally required the workforce to be paid equitable. So we see this in Colorado, for example, January 1st, 2021, the Equal Work for Equal Pay Act is being enacted. So we just want for us to be mindful and engage these populations in the workforce. So now we're going to talk about what is not changing. So going back to our first slide about the Angora goat, some pay structure designs are not changing, and some are becoming archaic. And as HR practitioners, it's important for us to be mindful of that. Just because something was effective at one point doesn't make them appropriate today. So as jobs are evolving and changing within the market, we want to make sure that we also reevaluate and update the pay structures accordingly. And so I think as an example of this, I wanted to drive a personal story that kind of drives this point home. As HR practitioners, we sometimes are looking at jobs, and sometimes the jobs aren't necessarily defined within the market yet. We saw this as preparing for this webinar. We were discussing on how in the early 90s or so, and it could have been even before that, Igor was working with the head of the IT department at a large company. And we were looking at one of the employees' positions that was classified as an application engineer. But they found that he wasn't really designing applications. And so they suspected that he may be misclassified. So what did they do? They looked at his job duties and responsibilities. So they did a job analysis to see what knowledge, skills, and abilities and responsibilities that position had. And what they found was something that, as HR practitioners, we see sometimes within the field, is that the job hadn't necessarily been designed within the market yet. So based upon the job duties and responsibilities, they looked at a network administrator. So fast forward to today, 20-something years later, and now the network administrator is a well-known benchmark classification. So we see this a lot in IT, especially. Jobs are evolving, jobs are changing, and it's important to keep up with the classification design to make sure that the classifications that we have are appropriate. So another thing that is not changing, pay increases do not affect wage inflations. And we talked a little bit about wage inflations in the previous slide. But what I wanted to share here was recently Mercer reported that the average annual pay increases in years was 3%. So that's barely enough to keep with inflation. So what we're seeing here is that if you have jobs like the AI engineer or the imaging specialist technologist in healthcare, these jobs might be growing in the market by 8% or 10% or whatnot. But if they're only getting 3% annual raises, the employees might perceive that they're being underpaid. And I would say that that's not something that's unusual where employees feel like they're being underpaid. So it's something to be mindful of. The last thing that is not changing is some HR practices do not factor market dynamics. So an example of this is minimum qualifications. So let's take, for example, a physical therapist. They're in high demand and we need more of them now. But now we require them to have a PhD, and this wasn't necessarily historically the requirements. So this obviously makes it harder to become a physical therapist, which means there's going to be less supply of them, and it's going to make it hard to recruit and fill positions. And while we're not disputing the need for a PhD for a physical therapist, it just goes to show that we have to be mindful of minimum qualifications and how those play into market supply and demand. Obviously there was one point where a physical therapist didn't need a PhD, and that's obviously a very sensitive topic, and we're not, saying one way or another, but it's just something to be mindful of, is how the market supply and demand will affect other HR practices. So the next slide, we'll talk about industries affected by the pandemics. So we're seeing that different industries are affected differently by the pandemic. And this isn't news to any of us, but some of these areas, as we were going through it, I was even surprised at how they were affected. So retail jobs, we're seeing jobs in clothing stores, car dealers, and general merchandise stores, etc. There's a decrease in these sectors overall, and not just because of the pandemic. There was obviously a higher decrease, when the pandemic occurred, and we've seen some bounce back since then, since places are starting to open again, but there's been a general decrease downward for retail overall. Airline jobs, this one's probably obvious, but we've seen some airlines laying off employees. I recently read an article that said the airline industry isn't likely to bounce back until 2024. So again, airline industries, they are decreased. Home food jobs, again, for obvious reasons, people are at home. There's an increase in that, which means an increase in jobs. Utilities, and this was one of the areas where I was kind of surprised on. You think people are at home, they're going to use utilities, but you have a lot of the big businesses that have been shut down and that reduce the volume. Also, you have people that are not necessarily being able to pay their utilities. So we're seeing a decrease in utilities. The next one is loan and banking, and we see an increase in that. Obviously, work can be done remotely now. As more banks transition to more electronic documents, people don't have to necessarily go into the bank to sign paperwork. On top of that, we're seeing low interest rates and people refinancing. So there's been an increase in loan and banking. High tech should be another obvious area. We're using technology right now to have this conversation and this webinar. And people are relying on technology now than ever before for remote work. Companies like Zoom and DocuSign are being highly utilized, so we're seeing more jobs in those sectors. Home healthcare is another area that is increasing. So we have to be able to provide service for populations. And we see the industry changing where now services are being augmented so they can be administered at home. So for example, cardiovascular diagnostics, some of those are being completed in home healthcare. And so we're able to serve people within their home with some services. So that is increasing. Production, obviously, for obvious reasons, is also decreasing. So in the next slide, we're going to talk about HR practices affected by emerging economic conditions. So really, and this should be no surprise to anyone, but really, COVID is impacting every area of business, every HR practice, essentially, from recruitment and staffing and how we're doing our sourcing, to class and comp, to training and development, employee relations. Everything's being impacted. And so what we really want to go through now is talk about some of the ways and trends that HR is being impacted, and then give you some tools and resources. So without further ado, I'll give it back to Igor for the next portion of the webinar.
Thank you, Michelle. And so the major trends affecting human resources practices, and one, of course, is shift in job values due to supply and demand and change in workforce composition, composition of jobs in the market, and industry change. The values of the jobs changing consequently, and that affects and creates inconsistent wage inflations, as Michelle already suggested. Some jobs growing faster, some actually are declining, and we'll show you a few slides to validate this point. With that trend, there's of course legal environment change of business, and we see the last decade's growth of minimum wage in many states, and equal pay legislation coming from federal mandate to state environments, state legislators. We see OSHA developments and all other legal environments changes, with, of course, rapid technological advancements and realignment of organizational values as well. There's more focus on pay equity nowadays. There's more focus on productivity, on engagement, on inclusion, diversity, and we discussed that already and show it to you in the next slides as well. Growing influence of market practices as opposed to just internal organizational policies. That is one of the major trends. And the thing is that we, HR practitioners, we need to follow those market practices and try to reflect our these practices in market trends in our policies and practices. With that, I'd like to have a little poll and ask audience what is it they think about growing influence of knowledge-based jobs in our economy. And the question is, and if Jason can put the question out there.
Hey, Igor.
Yes?
Jason actually got kicked off. I apologize, everyone. We've been having internet issues. So Jason got kicked off. So instead of polling, we'll just have people enter into the chat what their answer is.
Okay.
So if you just want to read the question.
Yeah, I'll just read the question and I'll give the answer. So
we can have them just into the chat.
Okay, sounds good. So the question we have is, what percentage of jobs require a bachelor's or higher degree in U.S. labor force market? A, and it's a multiple choice question, A, 21%, B, 35%, C, 42%, and D, 56%. And we'll give you a minute if you would like to enter chat and tell us what you think about that.
Okay, we're seeing some C's come in.
Good.
Or do you want to read the question again, just in case people missed it?
Yes, that's a good idea. So what percentage of jobs require a bachelor's or higher degrees in United States labor force today?
I see some C's. Anyone else want to chime in? More C's.
More C's, yeah, I see that. And the answer is C.
Good work,
Interesting.
everyone.
Yeah, thank you. And interesting that this trend was gaining momentum for decades. I mean, we have more knowledge-based jobs, and the area of critical thinking and decision-making and analysis in the job evaluations practices and methods is also gaining momentum. So I'm going to go to the next slide and validate this point. 10 years ago, Georgetown University conducted the study and predicted that by 2018, close to 2020, the number of knowledge-based jobs will grow to up to 45%. And as you can see that in 1973, that number was 28%. And what happens today is based on Bureau of Labor Statistics latest report, the bachelor's and higher degrees actually in job composition take 42% versus 58% that require no degree. However, even that portion of the jobs required skilled labor and knowledge of specialized skills that require certification, additional schooling, some college courses, and so on and so forth. This is how actually Bureau of Labor Statistics broke down the ratio between jobs, minimum qualifications, qualification requirements. As you can see that there's 8% of doctoral degrees and master's degree requirements, and of course 21% bachelor degrees, and 41% nowadays require high school or equivalent. We're going to move to the next slide and actually see how our labor market actually moving forward and what's changing in the labor market. So occupations that project to grow in the next 10 years based on Bureau of Labor Statistics are pretty much, in this case, percentage-wise, healthcare support occupations and community and social service, computer and mathematical occupations. When you look at it in terms of number of jobs that will grow within the next 10 years, the picture is very close, very similar. Healthcare support occupations are on the rise, and they will be, we anticipate that there will be more demand for these skills. Of course, food preparation and serving related occupations, and computer and mathematical occupations as well. Management occupations will be growing, and Bureau of Labor Statistics project that there will be 500,000 more jobs within 10 years. With that, actually, we're going to declining occupations. We have to really understand how the ratio and composition of jobs changing in the labor market to be able to redesign our recruitment training and compensation practices. And as you can see, executive, admin support, admin assistant, data entry keyers, travel agents, those jobs actually slowly reducing in their numbers, and some of them even will become obsolete. Here's the percentage change. The largest of them, again, word processors and parking enforcement, and many of those cyclical, repetitive jobs that don't require higher education, don't require critical thinking and preparation. With that, we're moving to rethinking of recruitment practices and what we actually can do about this. And I'm passing it over to Michelle to discuss what kind of practices we need to focus on now.
Thanks so much, Igor. So what should we be doing as HR practitioners to rethink our recruitment practices? We've come up with a list of trends to consider, and by no means is this an exhaustive list, but just some key areas that we wanted to, that we felt were important to note. So the first trend we're seeing is remote work is creating larger pool of qualified candidate. And as you have workers being displaced, potentially you have more workers in the workforce. But not only that, you also have a higher candidate pool because you can recruit to a higher. So if you live in Bay Area, you could potentially work across the country anywhere for remote work. So you're going to have a larger pool of qualified candidate. Also, less impact of local practices on recruitment packages. We're seeing this, and what we mean by this is local impact of local practices. So for example, sometimes you give sign-on bonuses to employees to try to help recruit in hard to work for areas. Well, now you're seeing less of an impact in that because you have a higher qualified candidate pool. We're also seeing changes in labor costs. So it's kind of a domino effect where we're seeing if employees are no longer going into the office and when they're working remotely, there will be undoubtedly an impact on employees' expenses. So many organizations, if they were leasing or they owned a building, can't need those anymore. So they might not renew their leases if more, if a lot of their employees are working from home. Additionally, there are new OSHA standards that we have to consider due to working at home. And this will be changing because we need to establish certain protocols in physical safety and security. So we want to look at ergonomics. Does the person have a quiet environment? Is it a confidential area? Heating and cooling and ergonomic type things. And so in general, business should be working on developing standards on what an office should look like for remote work and have those implemented and employees following them. So standardization is key. For the next slide, we're going to be talking about rethinking training and development and what that means. So the pandemic is also having a profound impact on training and development. First of all, more training and development is needed because we're seeing workers being displaced and jobs evolving. So one thing that we recommend is organizations consider doing an inventory skills analysis to look at what skills they currently have in-house in the organization and identify gaps. And then that's where the training and development would come in. We see a transition from instructor-led in-person training to remote trainings. With remote trainings, there's a bunch of things that you'd want to consider. Using more Q&A sessions, engaging visual aids, use of polls and breakout sessions. So you'll see that we tried to do the polling example for that one question. Again, trying to interact with people and make it a more active learning process. Other trends that we're seeing is mind mapping. So this is where you have like a single concept drawn as an image at the center of a blank page, and then you're looking for associated representations of ideas or images or words. So an example of that, if we're looking at HR as the center, and how is HR being changed by the pandemic? Well, we would talk about training and development and how that's changing. We would talk about recruitment, and those would all be branches of ideas from the mind mapping center. We would also be looking for active learning. So we're seeing a shift away from lecturing and having more engaging and interactive learning exercises. A lot of remote work, it's hard to stay engaged when you don't have the person in front of you in person. So active learning is really paramount to making the training and development most effective. So being able to have visual aids, diagrams, again, Q&A sessions. Cold calling is a very effective method, although not every student likes it. Essentially, this is where you're calling on participants. So you would call on Jane and Jack. And this keeps them engaged. It keeps them on their toes because they don't know if they're going to get called on. So they pay attention more. Again, chunk the lessons. So splitting the information into 10 block instruments, 10 blocks. for the presentation, so smaller chunks of information so that they can better digest it and learn more effectively. And then ad hoc quizzes, same thing with the cold calling. It keeps people engaged because they're paying attention and they're going to have more knowledge acquisition. So in the next slide, we're going to talk about employee and labor relations and how this is being impacted, what trends we're seeing. Obviously, whenever you talk about remote work, you're talking about working conditions and that type of thing. So this is mandatory subjects of bargaining. So as a general rule of thumb, it's always a good idea to audit your current collective bargaining agreements and see how that might be impacted. But what we really wanted to focus on here was employee and labor relations. So at the employee level, what we anticipate we're going to see is potentially less employee complaints. So if employees are not engaging in the office, there's less time that they're engaging with other employees. That could mean less less employee hostility and animosity and issues amongst employees. If you have a remote meeting that someone's facilitating and you see, two employees not getting along, you can always interrupt and stop the hostility and animosity right there. So there's a lot more control in that aspect where they're not engaging as much. And obviously we don't have any data yet, but we anticipate there will be less complaints. For labor relations, again, we've talked about OSHA and new standards, potentially less incidents of injuries from remote work. But again, we recommend having a standard policy of what that would look like in terms of the office setting for employees. So if there's a standard policy, you would be implementing that. Another thing is ways to keep remote workers engaged. Similar to what I was talking about with training, it's really hard sometimes for people to feel engaged and connected to their coworkers. So even though there might be less complaints, sometimes they feel less connected to their to their coworkers. So being mindful of that and thinking of creative ways that you can engage employees, whether it's team building activities, weekly meetings, sharing the video, all these different things that you can do to keep employees engaged is going to be paramount. So now Igor is going to talk about compensation practices and what we should think in the class and comp world and what's changing and how we can better be more proactive with it.
Thank you, Michelle. So how do we address change in values among various occupations? The job evaluation methods and tools, also many of them like point factor systems and the factor comparison, they're 60, 70 years old. And they're, while point factor system claims or those who proponents of point factors claim that this is scientific system and it actually calculates a value of each compensable factor. In reality, there can be much faster and much more robust, and yet still very accurate ways to evaluate job factors, compensable factors, and change job values. Again, job values will change dramatically, and that will affect inconsistent wage inflation. The way we address that is that maybe organizations should rethink this across the board, the same percentage increases that have been in practice for decades. If everybody gets 3%, it seems like a appropriate practice. It seems like everybody should be happy and we treat everybody the same, but in reality, we do not actually follow a wage inflation market and changes in composition of jobs in the labor market. We also have to acknowledge that if many of those increases are cost of living increases, we call them cost of living, and yet 3% of different salaries equates to different amounts, dollar amounts. There's also less impact of geographic differentials anymore. A massive number of employees working remotely for organizations. And by the way, we see more and more recruitment advertisement for and job postings with the jobs that are advertised as remote location. And what it means is that you no longer have to pay everybody Bay Area wages if you're in California or Silicon Valley. You actually normalize it by recruiting people from different areas, and they don't have such a high cost of living in those areas. Higher control of productivity and productive time. Now, just like cold calling that Michelle suggested, in the to engage and make sure that employees paying attention to what's going on in the meeting and how project is being developed, that there is a monitoring of productive time of employees who work remotely. And later on in some slides, we will cover the recent study that suggests that productivity didn't actually change, or maybe even improved in some organizations that offer remote work arrangements. And that will create shift to productivity or skill-based pay in those organizations. Of course, there's broader use of incentives, and the incentives are a separate subject that we probably wouldn't be able to cover today. But the trend we see in the labor market is that they become more targeted, more at risk, and more productivity and or outcome based. The thresholds of those incentives in some cases go down, in some cases go up. Market influences generally on pay administration and structures is very significant nowadays. Now, in the next slide, I'd like to continue talking about how we can change our job design to accommodate all those new trends and changes in the labor market. And again, from recent studies and just recent poll and research conducted by Mercer, skills become more important factor and becomes foundation in matching workers to jobs, as opposed to in many cases experience or seniority, like the knowledge-based job design. And in many cases, we had knowledge as if any of the participants familiar with FEC, which is FES, which is Federal Evaluation System, similar to point factor job evaluation system, that knowledge actually had the largest amount of points. However, just having knowledge does not necessarily means that worker will be doing better job. So in other words, you may know how to do that, but it's still not doing it. Changes in job evaluation factors will be a significant trend, and this trend will continue. Again, productivity of work done remotely, as we see, is staying the same or even higher than comparing to traditional workplace arrangement. And of course, future of flexible work environment is that it will continue. This trend will continue. 4/10s, 4 days jobs, or different start, different end. When people work at home, they work across the different time zones, and of course this will affect flexibility of workplace arrangement. And future of work settings. Again, recent studies suggest that 1 out of 3 companies will keep 50% plus of the remote work assignments. What it means is that even after pandemic, even when the economy goes back to normal, we still will have remote work arrangements. And as companies realize it's working, they will use it more. The next slide is about emerging trend of pay equity. I mean, we discussed that before, and the point we're trying to make here is that this trend migrated from just federal mandate, as you all know. 1963 Equal Pay Act was amendment to FLSA. It was passed 60 years ago, almost 60 years ago. Had amendments like Lilly Ledbetter Act and others, and the foundation, the core concept of this equal pay legislation is that workers measure their input with input of other workers, and the outcome or output they receive, essentially reward they receive for their input, with the reward that other workers receive for their input. And what happens here is if the ratio is unequal, the equal state equity exists. Otherwise, there's no equity. Like if I put the same effort as Michelle, and we both have similar education, similar experience, and we produce at the same level, and we put the same effort, but she gets higher outcome, or I get higher outcome for that matter, then of course there will be dissatisfaction. And in many cases, employees try to approach their superiors and address this inequity, perceived inequity. And if it's not addressed, they self-correct it, meaning they either reduce their input or they try to increase the output some other way. With that, I wanted to ask, again, audience. I don't know, Jason, are we able to do to poll audience and ask quick questions? Jason, you're muted. But I can read the question actually, and we can again use notepad.
Yeah, if you just want to put it in the chat option,
yes,
we can
okay.
tally it that way.
Okay, so the question is, how many states enacted their own equal pay laws in regulations as of today? How many states in the United States enacted their own? Again, there's a federal mandate, there's an Equal Pay Act, but there's also state laws and regulations. So it is also a multiple choice question, and A would be 14 states, B 28, C 36, and D 48. And we'll give you a minute to answer that.
So I see Michael had a guess even before you gave the multiple choice of 38. How about everyone else? I know there's a lot of people logged on. We'd love for you to vote. Get engaged. C 38. We'll give it another minute.
Okay.
Any other guesses? There's no wrong answers. Well, there is, but we won't judge. B. Okay, good. This one looks like it might be a little bit of a harder question because we have some variability in answers. So we have B and C and 38 as the guesses.
Okay. Well, I'm going to take you out of your misery, people, and please don't feel bad. There's no, you don't. I mean, it's not something you would know, and we know it because we studied. 48 states actually have equal pay protection, including Alaska, Hawaii, and Washington, D.C. They do provide equal pay protection at the state level. And the question again is, even though there's Federal Equal Pay Act of 1963, how is it that each state decided to take it into their own hands? because of the movement, because of it's becoming more important. It's becoming not just legislative issue, but also cultural issue for organizations. Now, there's also pay transparency laws. And that's when you really cannot prohibit employees to talk about wages and salaries and with each other. And there's also secrecy provision in that in some of the laws, which states that in many cases recruiters ask how much qualified candidates, they ask, how much are you making today? What's your salary? And then the starting point becomes the actual current salary that the job applicant or candidate has at the moment, which laws say it shouldn't be. There should be systematic, objective look at compensation. And of course, how we address this, how we address pay equity, how do we decide what actually to pay employees and maintain internal equity between employees within the same or similar, substantially similar jobs. The first step is, of course, select determinant of individual wage assignment. World at Work published published paper saying that the most common determinant of salary or wage assignment is relevant to the job experience, meaning the more experience they get higher within the range of the job to which that job is assigned. Of course, less experience employee is lower in the scale, in the range. Now, that's how you develop wage or range penetration model and curve. Now, some think that it should be linear. It should just go straight up. Some think there should be curve, inverted or introverted, or the logarithmic approach. We may talk a little more about this. And of course, once you know that, you need to apply the wage penetration factor to all employees consistently. And it's important to apply specifically to all employees within the same job or within jobs that are considered to be substantially similar. Remember, law does not say that it should be the same job title. It should be exact same job. Most of the state laws suggest that to maintain pay equity, you need to prohibit wage discrimination based on wages and assign equitable salaries or wages in the jobs that consider to be substantially similar. And of course, that should be recorded in your policy, so it would be foundation of your approach. And once it's recorded, the communication is always the key. We going to talk real quick about increases. If in our previous slides we discussed that across the board 3% increases, some of them usually defined as cost of living adjustments, is the practice that existed for many decades. Is this practice now really consistent with the dynamics of labor market? In this slide, you can see how actual wage increases, which we can get from either from research organizations, associations like World at Work, or from Bureau of Labor Statistics that actually tracks employer cost index. They track it every month and they publish it. And based on that, employer cost index is how much your payroll growth in average civilian employment growth from year over year. So as you can see in 2018, 2019, basically last decade, it was average of 3% increases. That's what in average payroll grew in the organization. That does not mean that every organization administered exactly 3% increase to everybody, but that's the average growth of wages, of payroll in those organizations. And yet consumer price index, which is the basis for cost of living adjustment, was was varying year over year. In some years, like 2014, 2015, it was less than 1 percentage point. And this year, actually, we're not sure if it's going to reach 2%. And now you can see actually real wage increases after the inflation, after the consumer price index. Again, those are real wage increases, and this is the difference between CPI and ECI, consumer price index, and employer cost index. The point here we're trying to make is that many organizations rethinking cost of living, not doing it anymore. Yesterday specifically, I went and studied, just be able to answer maybe some of your questions, and studied history of CPI, and I found that there were many times, many years where our inflation, our CPI was double digits. So if you follow cost of living, are you prepared to do double digit increases to employees when inflation will be double digits? I'm not saying they don't deserve it. What I'm saying is that businesses and government and public and private and nonprofit organizations exist to not only to provide services, but also to manage a good, effective and efficient business. We getting into almost last of our slides before we will be open to questions. Cost of living and cost of wages. Again, here's the example. Many organizations and recruiters, they still use practice of assigning salaries based on cost of wages. So I'm working remote. I'm here in Tucson, Arizona. So I decided, why don't I check how much I would be making in Los Angeles for $100,000. So if I make $100,000 here in Tucson, Arizona, for the same, to buy the same basket of goods and services, I need to make $165,456 in LA. Now I'm applying for a job, and to my big surprise, they don't pay me that much. They don't follow actual cost of living. But what they do follow, and this data is collected by Economic Research Institute, they do pay, and this is cost of wages. This is average salaries that they pay for similar jobs. They pay $125,000. You can see that there's not direct correlation between cost of living and cost of wages. And this is something recruiters and compensation leaders and professionals probably need to focus on when designing their system. One of the issue here is, how do you move employees through, and how do you assign this wage penetration that we discussed, and assign employees a wage progression model. So here are pay structures and how they been designed and how they evolved over time. You can see that A is a single rate. We're going back to Frederick Taylor's time and Henry Ford's time, when he would say all employees will be making $5 a week, all assembly workers. There was no difference. It was one fixed rate. Doesn't work anymore because, again, market evolved, labor market and economics. So B was a very broad approach in the government organizations when they say the maximum of our step system, the last step, would be equal to market 50th percentile or market control points, whatever control point or reference point we choose. C, of course, is widely used step system in a government still, where steps go usually 5 or 10 steps or 12 steps. Federal GS system has 10 steps from minimum to maximum with the bandwidth of 30%. Of course, later development was mixed step and open range system, where you move step by step, but then you have to let it go, and after you reach the market, you just make increases based on budget availability. And of course, E is open range system, widely used in private organizations and many nonprofit organizations. This is the last slide. Moving from step to open range structures is a trend, and this is something that pandemic actually exacerbate this trend. They expedited, I would say, this trend because of market influence on wage assignment, salary assignments. Step structures were built many decades ago. They're fixed, they're inflexible. You move from one step to another step, which usually anywhere from 2 to 5%. And those increases and moves are automatic in many cases, whereas open range is open and flexible. You get to the minimum or you get to whatever your wage penetration is, and you stay there until we can move you, until you deserve it, or until we have budgeted systematic approach to compensation. Increases granted by time intervals. 1 year passed, everybody feels they're entitled, they have to move one step. If they don't, they think something wrong. Increases in open range are depend on the budget availability, on the performance or merit or other criteria. Labor cost, difficult to control. You know that you have to spend this money because next year everybody is moving 5%, next step. Labor cost easy to control in the open range environment. Wage growth is predetermined, and most of the time it's a linear wage growth, where wage growth in a market-driven open range system can be designed as you please, as you believe better fits your business model and your business objectives and your pay policies and culture. And of course, inverted wage progression in step, because it's usually 3%, and the higher you go, 3% to every next consecutive step would be higher dollar amount. Whereas in open range, you can create logarithmic or regression where you decide what kind of curve you need to build. These are just some practices we could present to you and discuss within 1 hour time frame. We are open for questions now.
Feel free to chat your questions and we can fill them that way.
So I have one question here. I don't know if it was asked already. Are you seeing a trend in regionalizing wages based on remote work? To region employee is working where the company is located. For example, pay position more in California versus the same position in Texas or Arkansas.
Michelle, if you don't mind, I'll try to tackle
absolutely.
this one.
Mm-hmm.
Again, it's at this early stage. There's no studies no comprehensive scientific studies and research to suggest that wages are going down or they're normalizing because of the influence of remote arrangement in the job settings. But this is our assumption. We believe that yes, wages will become closer to national average because you will be hiring. You have now choice to hire somebody from outside of your highly compensated, high cost of living areas. Any other questions?
Another question. Unions have pushed and want a step system. Have you seen union pushback from moving to a open range structure?
In my experience, I have seen unions that actually were open to open pay structures, and I even remember the industries, specifically in education, and some other industries. It all depends on how union looks at wage progression and how they believe employees should be compensated. What is the conceptual framework? Essentially, I would say unions want the same thing we do. They want employees be happy. They want equitable approach and systematic approach to compensation, and that's what Open Range provides.
And I'll add on that communication is key, I think, in speaking with the unions and debriefing with them on what that would entail. I think that's also helped as well.
We have one other question that was thrown out there. And if anyone else has questions offline that they want answered when you end the webinar, it'll ask for comments or questions. You can fill something in there and our presenters will reach out to you. But the last question, which may be more of a legal thing, says, has anyone started looking at workman's comp claims to remote workers? Is it a workers' comp claim if the worker slips and falls in their home?
Michelle, you want to address this, or you had actual slides about OSHA regulations. I haven't read any recent studies on this.
I would have to look into that further to see if there's any studies on it so far.
It's probably a little early for this, but I'm sure that there will be some studies that will show us the workers' compensation state. And it's a very good question, by the way.
I do see another question, Jason, if you want to field this one.
Yeah, go for it.
PowerPoint training slides. I think you mentioned they're on the CalHR website.
Our PowerPoint slides?
The PowerPoint slides for this webinar?
Yeah, they'll be on the CPS HR website as soon as I hit the publish button. We'll also do the recording of the presentation, and that will also be available online. So just check cpshr.us, and then you go to the About section, and there's a webinar in there, and all of our webinar slides and recordings are there, as well as future webinars that do come up. So it's a great resource for anybody online.
Perfect.
Awesome.
Thank you, Jason.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you, Igor and Michelle, for the very helpful presentation. And thank you to everyone who joined us today. Like I said just now, please make sure to check out our website at www.cpshr.us for the slide deck and recording. Follow us on Facebook and LinkedIn if you are active. And we do post things like this all the time on those platforms as well. So thank you very much, everyone, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you, everybody, for participating.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.